Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to a special edition of Without History. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to those who are said to be without history, and yet birthed civilization itself. And today, we have a very special guest and a very special episode for you. We're going to be doing an interview with Brother Kamji, and we're going to talk about, well, additional perspectives and additional evidence to add to the many subjects that we've been covering on this channel. We are going to talk about the Sumerian Problem, and we are going to see what the data actually say, because there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to the Sumerian origins. A lot. So strap in, hit the like button, in fact, destroy that like button, share the link on your social media, send it to your family, and for those who can, click the hype button so that the algorithm picks it up. If you are in the chat and you can hear us okay, give us a thumbs up. Good? Okay, good. Looks like we are doing okay, so let's get started. For those who don't know, Brother Kamji and I, well, we go way back. We're talking all the way back to the days when Mr. Imhotep was publishing videos online. So I'm truly, truly honored to have him on the channel today. I want to give him the floor to introduce himself properly, but maybe with a bit of a leading question to kick things off. So, Brother Kamji, could you tell the audience a little more about your background? Where do you come from originally? What was your academic focus, or what did you study? And really, what was the spark, the specific genesis that got you so deeply into African history?
First off, I really appreciate you for having me on. I've been a huge fan of your channel for a very long time, the Without History channel and family, and it's just a blessing to be able to grace this stage. Now, about myself, I, for one, am a product of the American school system, and this is a school system that I harp on continuously, growing up in America, primarily in Texas and the West Coast. Many of my experiences, have enlightened my journey on this path. Now, being the descendant of a man by the name of G. Mangafoot, and G. Mangafoot would be the son of Mvon Ibrahim Bumbu Njoya, that history knows as King Njoya. My perspective about the relationship between contemporary Africa and classical Africa was always well informed by a variety of familial traditions. So, if you understand the history of the Mvona Bamum, the Bamum Vundam, the Bamileke people, and the Grassfields people in general, you'll know that there is an indelible, immutable legacy, oral legacy, testimony describing the sojourn from classical Africa or Pharaonic Africa into the current location in Central Africa. And these testimonies that I would hear from my parents, my grandparents, stories about my ancestors, always informed my desire to look at the correct picture with respect to the pharaohs, with respect to the Pharaonic civilization, and African civilizations in general. So that basically took me on the path to creating and establishing Kamjiverse. And Kamjiverse culminated from years and years of study, years and years of analysis, years and years of even field work on the continent itself. And it allowed me to establish this community based upon an authentic vanguard being stalwart soldiers of the truth. And we are closely affiliated with the Magi Archers. Kamji would definitively classify himself as a Magi Archer. And just more generally, we believe in promoting the truth about African people, right? So whether that's in engineering, which is my field, the sciences, mathematics, theology, architecture, we believe in promoting the truth about African people and African history. So that's who we are, Kamji, the vanguard, the protectors of the Mvun, the analog, Central African analog to the Magi, who are the protectors of the Nasut. That is why we are here.
I love the connection. In fact, I think more Black people should get names and nicknames from Kemet. There are already a lot of names in Africa that trace back to ancient Kemi. So where are you guys watching from? We love to know where people are listening from. We've had people as far as Australia before. So let's see what we get this time. So Kamji, what are you focusing on these days? I know from your posts that you're following the trail of the greats, like Ivan van Sertima and Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop. You're trying to add evidence of pre-Columbus contact between Africa and Mesoamerica. I know it's not the main subject of today, but I would love for you to touch on this a little bit before we get started. Just a little bit. I've seen some of your research on this subject, and it's littered with hundreds of data points, and we really need to bring you back so we can dive deeper on this. Even the areas, such as the similarities between the Kaskahal script and hieroglyphics, and I'm not talking about hieratic, but hieroglyphics itself, have been gravely overlooked.
Oh yes, alongside Sheikh Anta Diop, the great scholar Sheikh Anta Diop, in his exposition of definitive African origins of the Pharaonic civilization, Black origin of the pharaohs, one of the most contentious topics within Africana studies is just this pre-Columbian model, Ivan van Sertima's contact model. Now, most of the conversations surrounding Sertima are based upon polemics. They're not necessarily based upon scholarship. This is why you hear a lot of miscreants and neophytes repeatedly make the claim that Ivan van Sertima was trying to promote the idea that the Malian Empire under Abu Bakari founded the Olmec civilization. And that's not actually what he said in a lot of the contentions that he had with these Americana scholars. So the 3-volume set in They Came Before Columbus, African Presence in Ancient America and Early America Revisited from 1976 to 1998, right in the turn of the 21st century, is based upon conversations between Africana scholars and Americana scholars. And Diop was one of the main ones who spoke about the phonetic and morphological relationship between Wolof and Metrem-Kimi, or the classical Pharaonic language. And numerous scholars who came after him subsequently actually got into the ship vocabulary within Senegambia. Mariners, the mole mariners of Senegambia, who were encapsulated into the Malian Empire upon their expansion in the 12th century and 13th century. These mariners, the vocabulary that they used for waterproofing of the ships, for the ship architecture, the ship structural components, bears genetic relationship to similar ship vocabulary, analogous ship vocabulary in classical Africa, in ancient Kemet. In ancient Kemet, especially their reed papyrus boats, which have been observed as deep as the Lake Chad Basin of the Baduma people, definitively had the ability for transoceanic voyaging. And this is seen in the expeditions of Thor Heyerdahl. And the Alphabet Boys of the United States have even confirmed the evidence of this travel in a lot of their documents in relationship to Thor. But in general, what you must know is that the Americanist field is completely against any evidence or any proof showing that Africans made it to the Americas before Columbus. Even when they see black-looking or African-looking specimens like Monument F, a monument which most scholars identified as a human, bears more relationship, the zygomatic projection, the dolichocephalic skull, right? The extended labia. These specimens, the philtrum, according to Dr. David Kelly, these specimens bear more closer relationship to Africa than even Melanesian specimens and Asiatic specimens, which most Americanists on this topic, Erwin Palmer, Ann Cyphers, Michael Coe, Richard Deal, they will definitively admit that yes, there are black-looking specimens. There are specimens that look exactly like black people, but these are Negroid at best, and they come from Asia in the South Pacific, not Africa. That's as far as they'll go. But in general, when we're looking at controlled archaeological evidences of African contact, look no further than the legendary Caribbean archaeologist Dr. Earl Kirby, who definitively confirmed, according to the UNESCO documents, that African scripts existed in the Americas before Columbus, particularly Reef Bay. And look no further than the General Service Administration of the United States that has confirmed the presence in the Hull Bay of a 13th century remain, right, from pre-Columbian America. That is an African. That is an African person. We also have SJN 003 with an E haplotype, definitively connected to Africa and Mende populations in Mexico. Early 15th century, late 13th century, early or late 14th century, early 15th century, Mexico. And this is very, very crystal clear. And we don't even have to get into all the biota, the myriad from the threadworm and the hookworm, the myriad of biota, right? Plasmodia vivax, the myriad of biota from Africa that is found in Mesoamerica. Or even the similarities, Shuja Shuja, Dr. Aaron Kamugisha. These are African scholars with legitimate publications who have talked about the similarities, the orthographic commonalities between the writing systems in Mesoamerica, such as Monte Alban, and various writing systems of Western Africa, like the Vai and the Kikakui or Mende script. So it just goes on and on and on. I mean, this topic, even going back to Harvard's Allen Ancient DNA Database, AADR version 9 in 2024, defining BT-M91 and BT-M182 in Mesoamerica. African haplotypes in Mesoamerica. Even the Ancient DNA Explorer located these African signatures in Mesoamerica, in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, from Belize to Chichen Itza in the 9th century. So a lot of the historical Olmec references, such as Fernando Alva de Alva Itzulsochil, the Black Flower, speaking about populations from the Popoluca to the Nanoalcas to the Pinomies, traveling into Mesoamerica from the east, dark-skinned, woolly-haired populations. So you have 16th and 17th century indigenous scholars speaking about the waves, the multiple waves of migration from Africa into Mesoamerica. Legler and his exposition of the connection at the International Museum of Anthropology in Mexico, showing figurines, terracotta figurines with African affinities, associated with the same time that Ivan van Sertima, especially within his text, defined Africans coming in and being remembered within the mythos, within the theological systems of Mesoamerica. The different gods and deities. These Ikalanka people of the Olmecs. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Well, we could go forever with this, right? But again, there's a myriad of evidence proving, this connection. And Americanists, because they want to say that it was North Atlantic technologies that united American people and African people, and they don't want to accept that they could have been able to do this alone, even though you have Z maize and Gossypium hirsutum, Mexican cotton and Mexican corn in Africa before Columbus. The foodways definitively prove a connection. But again, this connection goes against their imperialist framework.
I recently did a video where we talked about the true Black African origins of the Sumerian civilization, and we looked at it from multiple angles. That video was way too short, admittedly, because I could not go as in-depth as I wanted in all the different areas that point to the African origins of the Sumerian civilization. But one thing that came out was the extreme interest from the community about the linguistic connection, the linguistic angle that suggests not only a unified Africa prior to and during the time of Kemet, but also attempts to directly link Black African populations to classical civilizations, such as the Neo-Phoenician civilization. Is that what you have found in your studies? Or should we reframe that based on what you have learned so far?
Yeah, this is another topic that has been very, very controversial. The, potential African affinity or even African origin of the Sumerian civilization. And numerous people within the Africana space have articulated or believe that there may be some affinity between these populations. Now, I had a scholar, a Sumerian scholar, a student of Sumerian on my channel in Chuck Morgan. And he actually exposed a lot of misconceptions that, many of us may have with respect to Sumer and with respect to the different identities of populations within the region. Because there's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between that which you call Kish and ancient Sumeria. And according to the analysis of Chuck Morgan, even the biblical reference and the biblical understanding of Cush as a descendant of Ham may have been linked to Assyrians who associated that region with Nubia. So it may have been a Assyrian political conflation as opposed to the real identity. Now you've had, others like Asar Imhotep, borrowing from scholars like Campbell Dunn in trying to link Niger-Congo with Sumeria, even going as far as suggesting that Sumeria is Bantu. And we're going to get into that Bantu conversation soon. But in general, by African scholars, there has been an attempt to take a more scientific approach when it comes to the study of African languages. And this is following after the historic comparative method or the historical linguistic method that is used for Indo-European. Now, believe it or not, the standard that is used for Indo-European is not the same standard by which Africanists use. And who are these Africanists? Africanists are white scholars who are, self-proclaimed experts on African languages and cultures. These are people who say that ancient Kemet wasn't black. A lot of these Africanists. Now, recently, some Africanists have been changing their tune, like the late Chris Ehret, right? Kevin McDonald. And, Africanists have been trying to become less racist, so to speak, as it relates to African history and African people. But generally speaking, their way of comparing languages and inferring, different linguistic genealogies is to compare vocabulary via borrowing, the horizontal exchange. So basically they collect a bunch of words and they see how many words other languages have that are similar to those words. And then they, try to infer a relationship as opposed to engaging in reconstruction or basically finding vertically the ancestor language of the descendant languages, right? And this is the difference between the historical comparative method and mass comparison. And African scholars wanted to follow after Benveniste and Millet and Saussure in applying the scientific historical comparative approach to Africa's languages. Africanists, these white so-called experts on African history and languages, are completely against this. Now, when African scholars did this, they found genetic relationship between the Pharaonic language and African languages. One of the first scholars to come to this was actually a diasporan by the name of Antenor Furman. He was a Haitian scholar. And you could say Antenor Furman is the grandfather of African historical linguistics. But moving further along, when you look at literature, particularly French literature, and you see Black African or Negro Africain, which is an early, 20th century idea and identity scholastically of Pharaonic Africa's affinity with Inner Africa, you can see the approach that was building, the development that was being built, by these scholars such as Lilius Hamburger. And you had Sheikh Anta Diop continue this in his development of Paleo-African, and Theophile Obenga transitioned this into Niger-Egyptian. And numerous scholars came after him. Umdigi, who is in his dissertation connected Bassa of Cameroon to classical Africa. You have Hilaire Ngomi, who compared his Bakosi language to the language of classical Africa in Cameroon. You have Mubabingi Bololo, who compared his Shaluba language, right, to the classical African language. Right, and Mubabingi Bololo is famous because you have students such as Jean-Claude Mboli and Asar Imhotep in their analysis, in their development of Chenentu, right, which would be their version of Niger Egyptian. They claim to come from Bilolo school. And Mubabingi Bololo is famous alongside other scholars like Musa Lam because he alleges that the Chaluba language is a direct descendant of the Pharaonic language in the same way Coptic is. And Musa Lam makes this same claim for Fulani. And this is a minority position. Most of the African linguists and Africana scholars are of the Obengian school, and they believe that the Pharaonic language is a cousin language or maybe an uncle or auntie language with respect to modern African languages in one Paleo-African family. But Mubabingi Bololo believes that they're descendants. And, Asar Imhotep and Jean-Claude Mboli follow this approach in their usage or their attempt to use these modern Bantu languages as a proxy of the ancient Pharaonic language. But it's very, very interesting that many of the scholars in this space, at least a plurality at the very least, come from the so-called Bantu area, right? Now, when we're understanding Kemet and the relationship to, different African populations, we can obviously see some distinctions with the Nukon people of Southern Africa, some distinctions with the Ethio-Semitic people of Eastern Africa. You see some distinctions with the Amazigh of Northern Africa, in the sense that we can't necessarily find a relationship, morphological, phonological relationship of the lexical items beyond areal diffusion and borrowing, between, the Pharaonic African languages, the Niger Egyptian or Paleo-African languages, and these languages. And that gets us to the Phoenician civilization, because many scholars have believed that, the Phoenicians, being a descendant of the Natufians, would be black, right? They would be of African origins, or at least out of Africa hub populations. And we know this when we're looking at some of these back migration lineages and even Eastern African lineages like EV1515 that is contained within the Natufian specimens that is found throughout, Central and Southern Africa, especially along the Swahili coast. So this East African lineage is present in, the Natufian remains. And this is one of the same lineages or similar lineages that is found in the Old Kingdom, the Nerurat man. And this man was dark black. He had black skin with a dolichocephalic skull. Right, so when we're looking at the Natufians being derived or being a descendant of an out of Africa hub, and the Phoenicians being derived from them, many intimate that with respect to this, even if Afroasiatic is not real, which many African scholars in this space, in the historical linguistic space, do not accept Afroasiatic beyond areal diffusion. They would see the Semitic people as an independent African origin people that spread out into southern Arabia and Yemen, these different regions, and populated these regions, right? So they're a distinct African group that we could observe even in classical times, but they're from a different language family than the Niger Egyptian family. And obviously there's many areal diffusions happening between so-called Cushitic speaking populations, formerly called Ethiopic by Theodore Benfi. These populations, these so-called Oromo people, Somali people, there was obviously areal diffusion. But the Oromo and the Somalis are more closely related to the Pharaonic language than they are to Amharic and Tigrinya in the Semitic case. So again, this is something that we could look at, even going back to Sumer. Many of these populations in the out of Africa hub, many of these Dravidian populations, many of these, recent African, expats in the Paleolithic times, they may have had a Cheddarman affinity. The Sumerians may have looked like Cheddarman, but the idea that they were closely linked, to Africa, to these pharaonic civilizations is not necessarily proven, so to speak.
This is very interesting. So this is one of those areas where, well, we have to dig deeper. When we look at some of the literature that is coming out of the Sumerian region, number one, you're absolutely right. The land of the two rivers is very large. It spans from northern Iran all the way down to Iraq. In fact, when the U.S. is, in this latest war, The US is finding out exactly how large Iran is compared to, to Iraq, which they took a decade or so to invade and try to control. However, let's put that aside. When scientists are doing the genetic analysis of the region, they tend to merge all these areas together. But the land of Sumer, Shinar, has some of its most prominent city-states in the south, around Kish, and expanding towards the north. But it's very difficult to find human remains that we can use, not only for dating, but also for genetic analysis in that region, because of the climate. But it is easier to find human remains around that region. So, one in the region spanning north towards Turkey, or more northeast towards Anatolia and the Caucasus, and then south, of course, where we find Kemet, and west, where we find the Levant. Now, interestingly, when we check the record and we check the genetic analysis, there's a recent paper, very recent in fact, 2022, from Yosef Lazaridis. He's an expert in genetic analysis, especially ancient genetic research. And what they find, even in the region of the Caucasus Mountains and in the regions of Anatolia and Turkey, when they do these genetic analysis, I'll show the table. Here you can see from these tables, this is raw data, supplementary data from that paper. What do you see? Even though you clearly see that when you read the paper, the analysis is, well, it's not mentioning this. What we find, in fact, is that the great majority of the individuals found in that region, and again, this is a region far north of Mesopotamia, the great majority of them are, as you'll see, dark-skinned. They have dark eyes or brown eyes and black hair. Isn't that interesting? I would love to know more about the detailed genetic analysis of this. When I started looking, I could only find superficial Y chromosome DNA. That wasn't very conclusive. In fact, it was, if anything, confusing, probably due to some contamination. But what I am pointing to is, when you look at the melanin concentration, the lack of the light skin allele, which is associated with people who have whiter skin, these are completely absent, or in the great majority, absent. And we are talking about areas that are north of Mesopotamia. That is the thing I would like to point you to. There is this great brother Hermann Hemstein. Again, I don't know why, it must probably be a pen name. But Brother Hemstein dug up research done some years ago that analyzed all the crania that were found in Kish and are now stored in the London Museum. The great majority, in fact, I'll show you that table so you can see for yourself. We know the usual tricks where they try to associate black people with what they call Egyptian stock. In fact, what they really mean is the ancient Egyptian stock, which most people don't know, but researchers know they are black. So in fact, the great majority point to the fact that they are indeed black. They display characteristics of dolichocephaly, characteristics that would identify them as black. And the exception here is the few elements that you find that are white. But as you can see, as we go deeper and deeper, or later and later into the Sumerian civilization, the ethnic association starts to change. It changes drastically towards the end. We can no longer call it a dark-skinned civilization. It is probably very mixed by then. So one might ask, how is it possible that the great majority of the depictions we see do not represent what even the genetic data is showing? You have to realize, if from the south, where the Nuerat men, we've all done the analysis, 100% are black men, it's not even close. And we are talking Lower Egypt, to Kish, to even Upper Mesopotamia and beyond, all of which had dark skin alleles, very dark, pretty much darker than my skin. There is no way that we can call that a light-skinned civilization. Does the language analysis show that as well? So, what about all these notions of Niger-Congo, Bantu migration, and so forth? Can you break down for us where and how these things are complete fallacies, if they are? Which parts or which elements of those theories are true? And which elements were intentionally introduced to separate black Africans from the culture of their antecedents?
Now, when it comes to Niger-Congo is one of these phyla that was generated by this mass comparison Africanist school. Now, the person who established Niger-Congo was actually a Nazi by the name of Karl Meinhof. Right? Karl Meinhof, who was a member of the Nazi Party, established Niger-Congo. And Wilhelm Bleek, who was another, colonial scholar, he is the one who generated what we know as Bantu, from Pritchard and Clark's Kafir class or Kafarian. Before it was called Bantu, it was called Kafarian or Kafiritic. And before Niger Congo was called Niger Congo, it was called N-word Idic. And you could read between the lines. So again, these families that we use today, that these Africanists, these white experts on African language and history, this is who these Africanists are. The language families that are created originated from racial insults. The Kafiritic with respect to Bantu, the N-worditic with respect to Niger Congo, the Hamitic or the Hamido-Semitic with respect to Afro-Asiatic, right? Nilotic being from that same root. Khoisan being created by Leonard Schultze, who was a zoologist, and on and on and on. When we look at these things, they come from these insults from these colonial ethnographers. Now, when it comes to the historical comparative approach, even the local nodes, like Roger Blench, who is a famous Niger Congo scholar, said there is no evidence, there is no proof of even Bantu and Bantoid being linked. And he even criticized Erit. And he said that there's no evidence that any of these language families are proven in the same way that Indo-European is proven. When it comes to Bantu and Bantoid, these come together via borrowing, via aerial diffusion. And there is a particular trilemma with respect to these so-called Bantu language families. For one, as we stated before, there is no historical comparative linguistic evidence that they form a unit. And according to Dixon's punctuated equilibrium, because of the amount of exchanges that happened, over the millennia, it may be impossible, right, to link these Bantu languages according to the historical comparative approach. And even Niger Congo languages according to that same historical comparative approach. So linguistically, you don't necessarily have any evidence that they're related beyond being a contact zone, a zone where they could trade different words together. And this is the case when you look at all of these African nodes, from Mande to Chadic. Many of these nodes were not configured properly according to the historical comparative approach at all. At all. Now, when it comes to archaeology, a lot of the things associated with the Bantu migration, like pottery, like iron, completely oppose it if we look at the fact that these things were evident in Eastern Africa, in the Swahili coast, when they allegedly were brought in. Now, the popular Africanist standard model would say that, these Eastern Africans, they're the descendants of Cushitic, so-called Cushitic-speaking populations that were conquered by Western Bantus. But they had these things prior to the so-called Bantu migration, according to the work of Felix Chami. Even when he looked at the schematic geometric amorphous drawings, which he identified as being part of the Tifinagh script, right, and connected to the Garamantes, there is evidence of trade, between the Pharaonic civilization and the Swahili coast in antiquity. And scholars like Felix Chami even posit that the land called Punt extended down into the Swahili coast and the coast between Tanzania and Zanzibar, right? So the idea that these populations came into what is now associated with the Iron Age via Bantu speakers from Western Africa has been completely refuted and completely debunked. Even when we looked at, LO haplography and the haplography of the LO haplotype, right, that is seen in classical Africa in the pre-dynastic era in Adaima, and is also seen in southern Africa, you can see that link among the New Kon people, the Koena people, many of the San people. They have the same type that is seen in classical Africa, in ancient Kemet. And you even see morphology with Narmer, right, in these populations. There's numerous similarities between their facial morphology that you see here. And you even have the canine mesio ridge present in the Daima and also being present among these same populations, right, in southern Africa. So you can clearly see that There was numerous interregional links, interregional bonds, and there's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between these different archaeological industries, especially as it relates to pottery, right, and the so-called Bantu migration. So again, beyond aerial diffusion, linguistically, there's numerous holes. Archaeology, there's not a pottery industry or an iron industry that you could one-to-one analog, beyond typology and the culture historical approach. There's not much that you could associate with Bantu speakers universally as it relates to pottery. Because you could have a pottery user who's a non-Bantu speaker and a pottery user that is, right? You could have a forest dweller that is a Bantu speaker and a forest dweller that's not. You could have a pastoralist that is a Bantu speaker and a pastoralist that is not. So you can't connect it one-to-one with archaeology. So there's no archaeological evidence of this mass migration at all. Now, when you go into the genetics, there's not necessarily ancient DNA from the Bantu region, right? You don't necessarily have ancient DNA from this region. Now, you have certain populations being developed, certain ancient DNA from the Great Lakes region that's recently been uncovered, right? But there's not a lot of specimens that you could infer, especially as it relates to millions and millions of people. Right? There's not a lot of specimens that you can infer a relationship, right, with respect to the ancient Bantu genetic landscape. There's a lack of specimens, so to speak. Now, we've done some analysis, particularly some of these Great Lakes remains, some of the ancient DNA that's been recently uncovered from the Great Lakes, right, that scholars certainly would connect to a migration south, right? Especially as it relates to the East Africa pastoral Neolithic. And many of these signatures of the ancient Great Lakes, again, are also related or closely linked to the pharaonic civilization. The Nurat Man, the Kadruka specimens of Sudan, many of the Khartoumian Neolithic populations are smack dab in the middle of the ancient Great Lakes and the Ibero-Mauritian culture of northern Africa. So genetically, the genetic evidence, the ancient DNA evidence, would actually support a multi-regional, multi-generational migration from the Great Lakes region to the Happy River Basin in classical Africa, and then throughout Western, Central, and Southern Africa, as is the case with respect to the spread of schistosomes, right? So if we have a holistic genetic analysis, we don't get the limited Bantu migration approach of these Africanists. We get interregional evidence where you have Zulu populations who could be linked, to the Oakhurst industries and industries of the ancient calendars that their ancestors built. You have populations of the Swahili coast rooted to these ancient Puntite Azanian populations, and on and on and on. The genetic picture actually promotes this approach. So again, it's a trilemma, a Manchusian trilemma, in the sense that the Africanist hypothesis is unsupported when it comes to historical linguistics, historical archaeology, and ancient DNA analysis. But the Paleo-African and Niger-Egyptian approach is actually widely and substantially supported by these same pieces of evidence. So, scholars like Mubalingi Bololo, he sought to use some of the naming conventions of the local people like Chiaka, as a replacement of the Africanist, Bantu program. You've had other scholars like Dika Aqua using the Ngala lineages from Wangala to Galasimo to Galanjam in his expositions of these different post-pharaonic polities, especially from the 10th century to the 17th century. So there's numerous African scholars who have wanted to build replacements, but generally as a hypothetical model, what we've gotten from the Africanists can be completely, dusted and thrown to the side. And this is coming from preeminent Bantu scholars like Theophilo Benga, who have even exposed that we should not use Proto-Bantu and Common Bantu when it comes to reconstructing the African pre-dialectical ancestors, because there's going to be a lot of facts that they mix. So again, they miss a lot of the truth. They want to separate from our deeper roots in classical Africa, and this is a model that we can completely reject.
So we get a lot of detractors who come onto our channels, right? And, some of the main arguments they bring, they always go, well, if ancient Egypt was black, how come all the artifacts we see online depict Levantine or white people? Or even beyond that, they'll say there is just no way that ancient Sumer was black because, well, all of the artifacts we see are, again, white or Semitic. And look, I use the term Semitic lightly here because, well, it's become such a bastardized term. It completely mixes up linguistic origins with ethnic origin. It's not the same thing.
So when it comes to the popular depictions of the Remenkimi and the Sumerians, you typically see this type of white Levantine depiction. And this depiction is not entirely accurate. Now, if we were to look at the historical linguistic approach, particularly the Niger Egyptian configuration, especially following after the research of scholars like Obadele Cambone, you see these different African populations referring themselves as black and using black, the divine blackness, black divinity, as a way of describing themselves and describing their origins and describing their theology. See, this is very, very important because you see, this type of onomastic tradition ubiquitously throughout the African continent. And this is what scholars have used, these onomastic traditions to link, different populations on the continent and to engage within the historical comparative approach to link these populations. Now, when it comes to Sumerian, there isn't necessarily as much evidence of the usage of black that they had to describe themselves. And because of this, because there's a lack of blackness and black divinity, many scholars have, basically been very, very hesitant to say that the Sumerians would be belonging to the same Paleo-African group. Now, when it comes to the Remenkimi, again, you have ubiquitous representations of black divinity, such as TT 51 in the tome of Usarhat, where you see Thutmose I, the third pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, being depicted as black and divine. Tome TT 359 of Amos Nefertari being depicted as divine in the same light. And even KV11, the tome of Ramesu III, where you see citizens of Kemet being displayed with black skin. And this is resembling the popular depictions of so-called Nubians promoted in Western scholarship. You even have the rock tombs of Meir in the 6th dynasty, where you see Niang Pepi and his son Pepiank being referred to as Hepi the Black and Heni the Black. So we see these different labelings of black divinity pretty ubiquitously in ancient Kemetic records. But for Sumerians, it's not necessarily the same picture. Now, when we're talking about ancient Mesopotamia, we have to be very, very specific because in many cases, Sumeria is used very, very loosely, when in reality, what we're referring to is different city-states and different polities. So you may have which is definitively a core city-state, and this is not necessarily the same as other polities like Nippur, right, which was a spiritual center of Sumer. You also have spaces like Lagash, and then Larsa, which was a Sumerian city but was later ruled by the Amorites. Then you obviously have Uriki, right, which was the capital of the Semitic-speaking Akkadian Empire, right? And then Uruk in Ur III. And scholars hesitate to conflate these different polities with, the general Sumer or the general Sumerian title. When we look at the Gudians are seen by most scholars as being foreign invaders and not necessarily Sumerians. And then you see the Neo-Assyrians who took over, and they are definitively not Sumerians. So when we're talking about Mesopotamia in general, we have to be clear in using specific titles and polities, especially those that come from the indigenous languages. In the same vein, in Africa, we want to be specific when we're talking about Wawat, when we're talking about Irju, when we're talking about Yam, when we're talking about Taseti. And we don't want to conflate these things. We want to have chronological considerations. So the Kush of the Old Kingdom is not necessarily the Kush that came under Kemetic dominion, especially during the New Kingdom. So we have to be very, very specific about how we're using these terms. But long story short, when we're looking at the popular depictions of the Sumerians, it is more than likely that they had a darker skin tone. Now, when I talk about, what they look like, I would be more comfortable with them, just from my analysis and research, being closer to Cheddar Man and being closer to these out of Africa hub populations, as opposed to being, markedly similar and analogous to inner African populations. But we don't necessarily know much about them other than the unibrow figurines. And the unibrow trait seems to be a ubiquitous Sumerian trait. This isn't necessarily an African trait, unless we're looking at individuals like Anthony Davis, right? This isn't something that you see widespread on the African continent. So we have to be specific. We have to be conscious and aware and have a meticulous approach when we are analyzing this data. But long story short, the reason that we see popular depictions of Levantine white people as it relates to ancient Kemet and ancient Sumer is because this is part of a propaganda program by Western scholars to show whiteness being associated with civilization and blackness being disbanded and disassociated from that very civilization.
So we keep hearing that Sumerian is a language isolate, that it's just sitting there by itself with no known relatives. What is your view on this? Or based on the linguistic connections you're seeing, is that isolate label just another way of closing the door on its African roots?
Now, the question of whether or not Sumerian, is deciphered as a language related to Africa is something that has been brought forth by Campbell Dunn. And the Sar Imhotep has used some of this analysis to amplify his idea that, the ancient Remen-Kimi language is really Bantu, and that, Chiena and Tu is actually one of the languages that we could use, the language families, to uncover the truth about Sumerian. And Asar has a very, very interesting way of relating, a lot of these families in Africa, these languages in Africa, to Sumerian. But most scholars challenge Campbell Dunn's research in asserting that he was not able to locate primary attestations for a lot of the words and terms that he used in Sumerian. And he was not able to relate this to so-called Common Bantu or Proto-Bantu. And this goes into some of the methodological problems because Bantu, the Proto-Bantu is a hypothetical reconstruction. Niger-Congo is a hypothetical reconstruction. And Sumerian is not spoken. It's a dead language, and it is a language isolate, meaning that it has never been proven to be related to any language, any contemporary language, any living language, right? It has never been proven to be related to this. Now, it is possible that it may be related, and you have scholars, who have suggested that Sumerian is actually related to the Uralic, family by Parpaloa. In the Uralic, this would include Finnish, the Finnish languages. It would include some, Central Asian languages, Hungarian, Estonian, and Eastern Europe, right? So this would be a lot of the languages that some scholars believe that Sumerian could be associated with. Right. And this brings up a lot of different issues because when we're talking about aerial diffusion and the way that these language families are pieced together, it speaks a lot to Nostratic and a lot of the hypothetical pieces of analysis that certain, linguists, the macro comparison or megallo comparison type linguists, the linguists who wanted to basically relate large language families under a macro family. This is some of the issues that they've come up against. So according to my research, Sumerian has not been proven to be related to the African languages, especially by the historical comparative approach. Campbell Dunn's research has not been accepted by the majority of Sumerian scholars. And what has been proposed by scholars like Asar Imhotep and John Claude Mboli has not been demonstrated and proven by the wider stretch of Africana scholars. Now, this may change in the future, but up until this point, the evidence is not substantial enough to support the idea that Sumerian is related to, these languages. Now, when it comes to the Natufians, we do have evidences in terms of craniometrics of them being related to these same Inter-African speakers, predominantly those being referred to as Nigero-Kordofanian under the Obangian approach, or Niger-Congo under the Greenbergian approach. But again, when it comes to linguistics, there's not enough evidence, at our disposal proving that Sumerian would be related to these Inter-African languages. So up until now, I would definitively say that it is a language isolate until further notice.
There is a very strong possibility that the Sumerians were closer to what we might describe as an ancient Chad phenotype, definitely a deep-seated Black African stock. Whether they were identical to the lineage of ancient East Africa is a crucial distinction. And it's exactly why we need more exhaustive genetic testing on those early Sumerian crania in the British Museum. But beyond genetics, the data shows that ancient Sumer was culturally and demographically derivative of the Nile Valley. In a recent video, I outlined how the embryonic forms of cuneiform are virtually indistinguishable from hieroglyphics. Cuneiform eventually evolved into that stylized, linear script we know today, but its roots are clearly elsewhere. We also need to dismantle the demonstrably erroneous notion that Sumer predates the Nile Valley. The city-states in Kemet and Nubia during the pre-dynastic era were not only older, but significantly greater in scale than the early Sumerian cities. In fact, fully formed hieroglyphics appear at least a century before the first formative stages of cuneiform even emerge. The timeline is clear. The Nile Valley set the precedent. Before we move on, I'd like to point something out. You probably all noticed, right? How Brother Kamji, he brings just so much evidence in order to prove or advance our points. We've all grown accustomed to the fact that African researchers, they have to bring an order of magnitude more data and connections just to prove a point. And even with that, it is often, it's just not enough. And I am now I'm fully convinced that this is intentional.
Ultimately, Black people have to start supporting Black scholars and Black epistemologies. No, the Africanists do not have the universal picture. They're actually excoriated in the UNESCO Symposium of 1974. They were excoriated. They do not have the universal picture. The Americanists, as it relates to pre-Columbian America, do not have the universal picture. A lot of times these white scholars will get you to believe that what they say is universal because they have the funding and they have the prestigious position, and many chronologists would even relate similar ideas. But the truth of the matter is no, they are not universal. They should not be accepted as universal, and you should take everything that they say with a giant grain of salt, right? You should understand that the epistemology matters, the framework that you're approaching these questions matter, the methodology that you employ to answer these questions matter, and the approach, the scientific approach that you're using also matters. These things are definitively important, and these will allow you to bypass a lot of the propaganda, like when Americanists say that there's no controlled archaeological evidence of African contact in pre-Columbian America. You could cite 1945.33 Hatchahead. You can cite 1978.412.39 Olmec mask from the New York Metropolitan Museum. You can cite K7187, the babyface figurine, or K6067, or even Griffin's object 2016-1222, and on and on and on. H.1.8.3A jade figurine from Honduras, and on and on and on. These are numerous implements, numerous artifacts and expositions proving this, but Americanists can't accept this because their framework of history and technological development says that it took North Atlantic technologies to link different groups of people around the world. And the idea that these different people were able to engineer vessels and conduct trade across the ocean before Columbus upsets their framework. So they won't accept it in the same way that Mormons, will not deny the apparent reality that Joseph Smith, right, is not a prophet, right? They will never, ever, ever, ever accept the truth about Joseph Smith because Joseph Smith is a core part of the Mormon religion. Nuwapians will never accept the truth about Malachi Z. because it is a fundamental part of their religion. And in the same vein, African people, black people, should be willing to respect and maintain the African-centered perspective, the Africana perspective, and be able to build it up into something great. This is something that I'm going to continue to do on this channel, and I appreciate Without History for having me on.
Kamjiverse. Can't thank you enough, Kamji. And a huge thank you to all our supporters and everyone who donated during the Super Chat. Seriously, it really helps us keep this research going. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Look, Kamjiverse and we've done the research, and we have determined, purely by the data, of course, that subscribing to our channels will change your life. We love you all. Stay tuned for more.